Zalkin, a partner in the Quantuma restructuring and insolvency team, interviews experts from the Airline Management Group to take an in-depth look at what is happening in the aviation sector, looking at its short-term and long-term prospects. In this video, the team delves into what might happen to consumer demand and how changes may impact the customer journey.
I can see, Ben, that you've got some views on this, and I know we've spoken about it before. So, and you've worked for major carriers operationally. So, give us your insight into some of this.
One of the things that the industry learned after September the 11th was that the various different security measures were not coordinated in terms of what different countries were requiring. And I think the industry at ICAO level and IATA level are taking a lead this time to try and influence governments around the world to take a common stance. I mean, we saw already, even in different countries in Europe and around the world, that even social distancing means something different. In the UK, it's 2 meters. In some countries, it's 1.5 meters. In others, it's 1 meter. So even on that level, we haven't got consistency. And it's absolutely critical that for a global business that we get as much consistency as possible. And I think so the three factors that affect that customer demand is there is, yes, a pent-up demand that at the moment regulation is holding back. And that is the authorities, governments, and we're seeing slight lifting. We saw in China, which gave us a small window on opening up domestic travel, and then leading up to their bank holiday in May, that we actually saw domestic travel in China grow more rapidly than was expected. We're talking here in Europe where the discussions that were happening in terms of borders between Ireland and France and in the UK maybe not requiring quarantine. We know that Australia and New Zealand are speaking to each other. We know that some of the countries who have had less of an impact in terms of their mortality rates and have been able to control their populations more, now that they're starting to lift them, countries like Denmark and Czech Republic and so on, the sort of lighter touch, they're also speaking. So there may be these travel bubbles that appear, either on the short, mainly on the short. We said domestic would start, and short haul networks. The big challenge is going to be the long haul. And what have airlines been doing in terms of that? Because as both Chris and Riga said, one side is the regulation, the other side is actually confidence, the customer confidence. And obviously everyone is different. Everyone is going to have their own perspective on how they respond to opening up of lockdown. But there's one thing is absolutely critical, that the safe and secure feeling that is paramount to the global airline industry, and that is a non sequitur for any company. It's the primary factor is safe and secure. We add this third factor of biosafety, and that biosafety now has to be incorporated into everybody in the value chain. And that goes for the in-flight catering as well. There was that question from Donata. Everything, the whole chain is going to have to respond to this. And I've seen some airlines who've actually already produced videos of what it's going to look like to walk through their hub airport, the various different checks that are going to take place, and the minimizing of personal contact. They've already promoted that, and they're already showing it visibly as customer experiences of what the future may hold. Yeah. So the first is regulation. The second is that feeling of safety. And the third then, of course, is the loyalty to the brand. And where the customer actually, there may still be less choice, but there will be choice. Yeah. And so therefore the factor is what are the airlines and all value chain doing today to maintain that customer engagement, even during these dark times? And I follow Peter's view of being an optimist. I think it's Winston Churchill that said that a pessimist will A pessimist will see difficulty in every opportunity, but an optimist will see opportunity in every difficulty. I think really for every businesses, and for those that are part of the value chain of an airline and for those that are in an airlines, is right now is to say, what are these opportunities? How do we engage with our customers? Just one more point. Some of the airlines have been interestingly engaging customers. Their crew are multilingual. And they've been giving language lessons online. Others have been promoting their own national cuisine. And I've seen some destinations who've been extremely innovative that have asked their residents to put a GoPro helmet on, and people can sign up to go and visit a particular nature spot with a local guide, and you can control it from your computer. So those are the kind of things that companies can be doing right now to maintain engagement with their customer. But fundamentally, it'd be the regulation and that attitude to feeling safe on board.
Thank you. There are a huge number of questions coming in, and we're not going to have time to answer all of them, but I'd like to try and distill them down into sort of a few common themes. You mentioned there, Ben, we had the question that came in from Donata about how they are going to be able to sort of adapt the particular services, the catering services that element of the business provides. We've alluded to some of those things. We know that we're all going to have to adapt to some sort of global standard. That will have to be agreed. And this is one of the great worries for me, is how do you agree those global standards? I personally find that the task is a huge one, and we're not going to solve it here. I agree there's lots of pent-up demand, etc., but how you actually do it and do it all safely. One of the questions or themes that's coming through, and we've actually got two slightly competing views. On the one hand, we've got somebody who's asking a question about, we talk about using more modern fuel-efficient aircraft, and we've talked here very briefly about the A380, no longer really sort of more or less being grounded, older 747 fleets, etc. The four-engine aircraft. Somebody's asking, we talk about these more modern fuel-efficient aircraft, but the question is, they're prohibitively expensive. Will global institutions be set up to provide more reasonable leasing costs? Well, I'm sure that those who are leasing the aircraft would want them, and those who are, so different views there. But then on the other side, we've got somebody saying, will the current situation incentivize the use of smaller airports, more narrow-bodied aircraft? I know, Peter, you've talked about the what you see as a move towards longer point-to-point journeys without travelling through hubs, using very fuel-efficient aircraft like the 787 and the A350.
Certainly, those aircraft have come into their own, and they're beginning to show quite substantial returns. I can't remember specifically, but I think if you find the trip seat cost, which is one of the KPIs an airline will measure on those wide-bodied but more efficient aircraft, is the same as that on the 380. That therefore creates a situation where airlines can then look at point-to-point operations and still achieve the same economic efficiencies that the 380 and other aircraft, 747, generated by going through hubs. So I think that particular model was beginning to change anyway as a result of that type of equipment, engines and airframe, and I think that will accelerate. So I can see that being, and that's what I referred to when I said that the airline industry perhaps ought to reset itself. But moving forward, I think, and Ben is right in terms of all the immediate opportunities, but there still lies a fundamental question. Can the airline industry behave itself well enough that when it gets back to some level of normality, that we don't just follow the same downward spiral we have in terms of generating huge amounts of capacity, and therefore get ourselves into the position in 5 or 6 years' time as we found ourselves more recently before COVID-19. So I think there's some huge structural issues, and I believe that the airframe, the engines, and the way consumer confidence exudes itself, how people will start to travel, will have a significant bearing on that, and we need to listen to what the consumer says within some sort of, hopefully, unified regulatory global environment.
Chris, you wanted to come in there.
If I may, Paul, couple of things, and I think Ben's point about different lockdowns, is absolutely that. It highlights the importance of having the data and the transmission of the data about how destinations are and how origins are. And again, that's something in other forums I've been on that people have made it very clear. This is part of the communication at an international, pan-national authority to make sure we know. I think the next point, as Peter said, is absolutely fundamentally important. We've seen it. We've seen a number of hubs going what I would call ex-growth, much more movement to point, and then we've obviously got the A321 XLR and everything that goes with that. But I think there's also an issue in the current period about the physical ability of airports to accommodate testing, if testing is seen to be the way forward. And certainly I mentioned the survey we've done, and I'll make the results available soon. We're just analysing them at the moment. But the importance of testing rather than temperature taking, and there's some concerns about temperature taking. There have been examples where it's been 85% wrong, 100% wrong, whatever. And if we have to have testing of passengers who get off one aeroplane before they get on another aeroplane, before we get into an environment where some of us will have COVID-19 passports if we've had it, I think that's fundamentally important and reinforces your point, Peter, that we're going to go more point to point. And then there's another issue about the environment. And some have said, well, it's all focusing on the economy at the moment and the environment has fallen down the track. I don't think it has. There's a very simple question that people are asking is just how much travel do you need in the future? And my view is that we will see more binding environmental legislation brought in earlier, and hopefully that will act as a catalyst for a focused approach to funding the commercial affordability of whether it be electric aeroplanes and the batteries that go with it or synthetic fuel. And, you know, it's exactly the point that others have made. This is a fundamental resetting of this business. And
so, Chris, that's a very good sort of point at which to draw in some other sort of cultural shifts that we've recently seen. And I know one of the questions that's coming up from the panelists, from one of our delegates, refers to Zoom, home working. We have, as a global community, all had this dawning realization that to an extent, and I say to an extent, of course, we have been able to sort of adapt, work from home, operate remotely, communicate, most importantly, remotely, without the need to jump on short-haul flights to go to business meetings. There's a massive cultural shift there. If you overlay other sort of cultural drivers as well, environmental lobbies, etc., those things are going to have a very fundamental influence on the shape of the industry going forward. Now, one of our delegates has said, given that, all of these cultural factors, is airline travel going to become the sort of preserve of the wealthy? Is it going to become an exclusive thing because the rest of us are going to be sort of driven out of the market because cheap short-haul travel will no longer be in demand?
Yeah, there's a risk of that, but it's driven by factors rather than, it is the preserve of those who can afford it, but it's driven by the cost side of the additional cost, which certainly for the foreseeable future will be an element of air travel. And we have to move away from this notion that airlines have to be able to set fares that enable them, as Peter said, to generate a return on their capital. And we can debate, and it's exactly that. There's a huge distribution of airlines where you measure on their economic return rather than their financial metrics to a small island nation or a small nation. But what we have to recognise that perhaps the day of really cheap tickets has changed. And yes, there is a societal impact to that for those who are able to travel and benefit from being able to travel at lower cost. So it all has to be considered. But if we look at the fundamentals are pushing towards something that may cost more.
I think we have to separate the different segments of the travel market. I can't see Zoom replacing a holiday in Italy or on the Greek islands. And nor can I see it in the long term replacing hugging your granddaughter or your grandmother. And those of us who've been in isolation, though we've been Zooming our relatives, now children and grandchildren, we know it's not the same. But Zoom will have an impact on other aspects of travel, particularly the business travel and the conference travel. And I think it's there that we'll see the impact, because as we've had a brilliant panel this afternoon and we've got 400 people listening in, we don't have to take those 400 people to an expensive hotel in Paris in order to communicate with them. I think conferencing will change. I think business intercommunication will change. But leisure and visiting friends and relatives, I do not believe will change fundamentally.
Look out for the next 3 parts in this series on the Quantuma and Airline Management Group's LinkedIn channels and websites.